Started to cry, pushed my chair back, and then I blurted it out. And I said, "I'm sorry. I just hope I haven't let you down." Well, when I said, "I just hope I haven't let you down," that said it all. I had.
In 1968, he was elected President of the United States of America with the promise of restoring integrity to the government after the tumultuous Johnson administration. In 1972, he was re-elected in one of the largest landslide victories in presidential history.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
2 years later, Richard Nixon was forced to resign the position in disgrace.
How did a man who won 49 states and over 60% of the popular vote fall so drastically, leaving both his legacy and the perception of the presidency stained by one of America's most devastating controversies? Despite his neurotic personality, the early story of Richard Nixon had always been one of law and order. However, the eruption of the Watergate scandal unraveled a deep history of lies and deception within his administration.
I didn't believe that we were covering any criminal activities. I didn't believe that John Mitchell was involved. I didn't believe that, for that matter, anybody else was.
Although Richard Nixon accomplished a great many things for the U.S., his actions forever tarnished the office of the presidency.
Forced to grow up in the indignity of a working-class environment, young Richard Nixon became an angry, bitter man. He felt ostracized by the wealthy elite, but simultaneously craved their acceptance, which grew into deep resentment for the more privileged.
Richard Nixon seemed to me a person very uncomfortable in his own skin. He felt, I don't know, a sense of inferiority, and maybe that drove his persona.
Early in his political career as a representative from California, Nixon acted on his envious impulses, spearheading the 1948 HUAC investigation of Aldrich Hiss, a prominent and respected Washington insider and communist spy. This animosity returned after serving as Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years, when Nixon ran for the presidency in 1960 against John F. Kennedy. Kennedy represented another Hiss for Nixon, a man who never had to work for anything in his life, while Nixon had to struggle for everything.
Nixon never got the breaks, the credit, the adulation that the Kennedys got, and people like that. And that wore on him.
Losing the election took a toll on Nixon, as winning would have symbolized the ultimate approval from the privileged. His defeat meant that he would never lose again, and once he won, he would do anything to maintain his power.
Nearly a decade after his failed 1960 campaign, Nixon re-emerged on the national stage. In 1968, he won the presidency, running on a surge of popular discontent with the Democrats and on the promise of ending the war in Vietnam. Nixon's first term was a success. He opened relations with the Soviet Union through his policy of détente and broke the barrier between the U.S. and China while drastically reducing the number of troops in Vietnam. With his popularity at an all-time high, President Nixon's re-election seemed inevitable.
It seemed to me that he should have been happier. And there was not a lot of happiness that night. I don't quite know why.
Richard Nixon won the 1972 election with a stunning 520 electoral votes. However, even in the face of such overwhelming public adulation, Nixon's paranoia and secrecy continued to dominate the White House. 5 months prior to the election, 5 men were caught trying to break into the DNC headquarters at the Watergate complex.
5 men wearing white gloves and carrying cameras were caught early today in the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in Washington. They apparently were unarmed, and nobody knows yet why they were there. I don't think that's the last we're going to hear of this story.
All 5 of the men involved in the Watergate break-in were tied to CREEP, the committee to re-elect the president.
Watergate was like nothing. It was, you might recall, Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, termed it a third-rate burglary, which in a sense it was. The break-in, that's the focal point, but that was just the head of a pin compared to the bigger issue.
The foundations of Watergate were laid long before the actual break-in. For years, Nixon had taped all of his meetings. However, crippled by paranoia, he began bugging members of his own staff. As time progressed, he developed a serious lack of faith in the existing bureaucracy.
Once it became clear that the Joint Chiefs of Staff were spying on him, Nixon created back-channel intelligence operations, such as covert communications with China, in order to sidestep the separation of powers provided for in the Constitution. Before long, he began to use such questionable tactics to further his political agenda. Nixon formed a unit known as the Dirty Tricks Squad to carry out acts of espionage and sabotage against his political enemies.
Nixon was setting up this intelligence operation outside of the CIA, outside of defense, outside of the State Department. And the other thing was, in an attempt to plug leaks, he created the Plumbers Unit.
In 1971, a detailed history of America's military involvement in Vietnam, known as the Pentagon Papers, leaked to the public. Documenting events prior to Nixon's administration, it could not incriminate the president. However, Nixon and Attorney General John Mitchell foresaw a dangerous trend in which classified information concerning his secretive operations could be released to the public. To carry out their purpose, the plumbers orchestrated break-ins and wiretaps on a massive scale.
Now this is 4 years into the administration. You have a certain sense of omnipotence. You know, you can do no wrong. You control all these levers of government. What's a simple breaking and entering thing?
The Watergate affair had no immediate impact on Nixon's campaign. High-level officials were not linked to the scandal until March 1973, when James McCord, one of the burglars, wrote to Judge John Sirica implying a conspiracy. Though Nixon was not involved in Watergate itself, he was aware of the cover-up, clearing hush money for one of the plumbers who planned the operation. He also approved John Mitchell and White House counsel John Dean's plan to play it off as a CIA operation and divert focus away from his dark history.
Mitchell was concerned about, as he said, we've got to cover up the White House horrors.
Nixon continued to deny involvement in cover-up attempts. Despite efforts to contain the scandal, it quickly reached Chief of Staff H.R. Haldeman, as well as Dean and key aide John Ehrlichman, all of whom Nixon was forced to fire in April 1973. To protect himself, he ordered the prosecutors to stop the investigation. When they refused, he fired them and was known as the Saturday Night Massacre. The new prosecution team demanded that Nixon turn over his tapes. Citing executive privilege, Nixon argued that the president cannot be implicated in a crime and refused.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
Both the courts and the public rejected this argument, forcing the tapes to be turned over. One conversation from 3 days after the break-in contained an 18.5-minute gap. This was the final straw for the investigative committee. The Senate began to draft articles of impeachment against Nixon, charging him with obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress, but they never got the chance to vote on the issue.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
Nixon became the first president in American history to resign. With Gerald Ford's controversial pardon just 1 month later, the American people never got the closure they needed.
America has not yet fully recovered from the impact of Richard Nixon. Though the public's faith in an idealized political system had already been shaken before Watergate, Nixon cemented the feelings of skepticism and distrust in the government. The seeds of the scandal had been sown in his youth. Every step he took shaped his manipulative mindset. He became a victim of his own character, but he would not be the only one.
I let down our system of government, dreams of all those young people that ought to get into government but will think it's all too corrupt and the rest.
As a result of Nixon's actions, there is a much greater transparency in government today. The secretive tapings of presidential meetings ceased to exist after Watergate, and public outcry led to the amendment of the Freedom of Information Act in 1976. The scrutiny of high-level public figures by the media has never been more intense. Nonetheless, Richard Nixon robbed the country of many things. He robbed it of trust, instilling cynicism in its place. He robbed it of integrity and stability, replacing them with corruption. Most of all, he robbed America of the potentially great leaders who have come to think that politics is a dirty game.
Yep, I I let the American people down. And I have to carry that burden with me for the rest of my life.